Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to Steve Gudeman, who I've known a little bit for a very long time. Steve, when and where were you born?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, and I grew up outside of Chicago and lived there until I went off to college. We lived in the suburbs, about an hour outside of Chicago. My father was a merchant, a high executive, and we lived well. I mean, I wouldn't call it upper class, but we certainly lived good, strong, I'd say middle class. I was, fortunate. I went to what was considered to be a very, very fine, as we call it, high school.
Let's slow you down a bit.
Yeah.
Grandparents.
My mother's father, my grandfather, maternal grandfather, actually he never went to college. His father had died early, but he was an architect, and he was an extraordinarily successful architect in Chicago. About 3 years ago, I had a delight. There was a book written by an anthropologist on the Chicago Board of Trade, and she went back as part of the history of it to get the architecture for the building, and there was a competition. This was probably 1919, 1920, somewhere in there. It might have been more in the 20s. And she had a whole chapter on the architects. And so at the beginning of the book, she mentions me, and we come to this chapter on the architects, and my grandfather had participated, and I found it because I said, I know that drawing. There was a drawing of his. It's the only book in which I am both, I'm with him in it with my grandfather, and I got a huge kick out of that. I don't know if the rest of my cousins did. He was a very successful architect. He was not, there's a famous Chicago, I'm interested in architecture but no expert, famous Chicago School of Architecture. Well, it starts back with even earlier than Frank Lloyd Wright. He was Prairie School, Mies van der Rohe, and so forth. My grandfather was more of a classical one. He was not a wild one in that. I won't go on about that, but it's very interesting, and I certainly wouldn't have the talent to be an architect, but I can see the pleasures in it and what it would have meant. My paternal grandfather died way before I was born. He was a chemist. He had a PhD from Columbia. I think taught there for a while. Became an industrial chemist, consulting before the big-time consulting things came up. Private concerns doing it, and in-house. I think he was successful for a while, but I think he was reasonably broke by the time he died, and which probably motivated my father to make sure that he was successful. And it could go on. There was a large family, I'd say, on both sides in the Chicago area. Most of them had come from Germany, one part had clearly come from what's now the Czech Republic, Prague, and where there were, I think, one was a rabbi and so forth in Prague. His name was Alschuler. Alp School is in Prague, the old synagogue there. And they probably 1860, 1850 came basically either from the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, or from Germany, and moved to, not directly to Chicago, but to different areas. So my family had been there for a while, but nothing like England and so forth. And I think it's hard to characterize it, but of course Chicago was the home really of pragmatism, and Dewey and others who had a profound influence on the schooling system. So I went through what were called progressive schools, not sort of where you would move ahead on your own, and I was lucky, I think. It was very good.
What about your grandmothers?
My grandmother on the architect side was a very strong woman, and she wrote books on. There was one that was quite, at time known painting and personality, kind of into psychoanalysis and so forth, interpreting children's painting. And she was one of these, well, not quite a grand dame, but she very near it, involved in all different kinds of things. I think, I'll be honest, I don't think to the benefit of her 5 children, of which my mother was one. She was a very domineering woman. But I knew her. She was alive. She was alive until she was about 90. And I knew her. I could see the difficulties it might be to be a child of hers.
But she was all right with you?
Yes, yeah. She would, I don't need to go into it, she'd play favorites. So for a while I was a favorite, but not forever. And my mother kept her distance from her, thank goodness. For all of this. On my father's side, his mother was older, and she must have died when I was 12 or 13. And I remember the funeral because people talked about she was also involved in charitable work and so forth in the Chicago area, but she seemed very, much older and constrained. Now, this is a total aside, but when I ever tried to picture what the Protestant ethic is like, and it seemed to me, I could just always picture her, and I'd say passed down in my family, thrifty, don't waste anything.
Don't waste time, don't waste resources.
And not flamboyant or anything. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm laughing about it. I knew that ethic before I read about it.
What about your parents' characters as people and how they might have shaped you? You mentioned your father's position, but...
Well, my mother, she never really, I think, settled happily into anything. My father...
They're both dead, presumably, now, are they?
Pardon?
They're both dead now?
Yes. Yeah, my father died actually rather young. They both died of cancer. So I'm assuming that's my fate. So far I've outlived my father. Pretty soon maybe outlived my mother. Who knows? I think in retrospect that my mother was supportive, but she could be quite critical of things that one did, and that is not the way to raise children. My father was very different. He was extraordinary. He's a very bright man, but he was a businessman. I don't think either of them really understood or highly valued education, but not necessarily being a professor or something like that. They could never quite understand, for example, anthropology, why anyone would do it. And maybe they were right, I don't know. But he was a businessman, very successful at it. And, but not, well, later, I think he did a lot of things. He would play with me, we did sports a lot, he was an excellent athlete. I think that he was very organized, very creative, I think, in his business, but also highly organized. I remember about the age of, must have been 10, 11, 12, and my desk was a mess. And he showed me how to organize my desk. Now that sounds silly, you put the papers here, you put them there, but it really, that stuck in my mind, that ability to organize.
I notice you have an organized desk
Absolutely,
here.
yeah, they're not in different piles. I remember asking about that. He said, well, no, he doesn't get them, but it's organized. I've always been organized in my work ever since, but I sort of had to learn that from him, but ever since, except when I'm starting into something, and then it's a mess, and it'll be a mess, and that's okay, because I know it will get organized. And so often when I talk, I go 1, 2, 3, and get the points in order. It's the way his mind would work, it's the way my mind worked, but that's just a minor one. He always emphasized to work very hard, but to have fun and to enjoy life. I've do work hard, but I've carried that through, especially with our children, trying to get them to see all aspects of life and enjoy it. It would be, he was hard on you. That's too strong a word. He'd be disappointed in you if you didn't work hard. But he was always supportive. Always very overly proud. I have an older brother, overly proud of his two sons. So, yeah, a really extraordinary man anyways. Now, I would say for a while in my 20s, some difficulties with him. We didn't always see eye to eye politically. Or, you know, and he was, he was high executive in what was like the second largest corporation in the country, or so. And then for anti-Semitic reasons, he should have been head of it. He was passed over, and that had a profoundly bad effect on him. He left that company finally, and that had been his life, and he had been the golden boy there. And then within 6 months, he went into the Kennedy administration. Jack Kennedy had just been elected. Was there for 2 years, but that really, he was not a politician type at all. And then went to New York and became a partner in a very high, well now different firm, but then one of the, I guess, two largest Lehman Brothers. And he was
Lehman Brothers.
Lehman Brothers. That was when Bobby Lehman was alive, and when it was a different firm. And it was about equal to Goldman Sachs. When Bobby Lehman died, my father got out after about 10 years and said, "Watch out, they're going to fall apart." And he knew
Do you think your central work in anthropology has been in economics? Do you think that this has been influenced by your having a father who's...
I think, well, I did go to the Harvard Business School at one point, and he wanted me to go into business with him and have a business. He said I didn't want to do that. That's a different part of the story. I think yes and no. Of course, you're jumping ahead to my kind of economics, which is very resistant to formalist kind of analysis. Yes. He didn't. He might have had a little training in economics. That was not the kind of economics. I think the mode of thought, more pragmatic, would have influenced me. I don't think quite so. I took in college in the United States before I went to Cambridge. I remember I said, well, I'll take a course in economics. And there's a famous called Ec 1, and I remember, supply and demand curves and all of that. I really didn't find it that interesting, but at one point, the teaching assistant started making claims, actually right about exactly what my father had done. He was talking about Sears Roebuck and Company and how they had a monopoly, and actually called it, I suppose, a monopsony, on buying refrigerators and washing stuff. That was where my father started. So I said, "You're wrong," and then he got mad at me. And he said, "No, they're all making all the money." And he didn't know that these people who headed these companies would come to our house and stay there. And my mother would say to my father, "All these guys are millionaires, why aren't you?" It was exactly the reverse. And that really put me off from formal economics. And I quit that course, as a matter of fact, and never took another economics course. I don't know what that means. But the formality of it was very removed from everyday kind of life. My father's strength was, he felt, and I think it was true, he's an absolutely charming man. And he could talk to any subject and charmed people. He was very good at personnel. The other thing he emphasized, and I see I'm coming back to this in what I'm interested in, is he was not out directly to make a profit. He wanted to bring goods to people at a good price. We could never use the word cheap in our house. It was inexpensive and at a good price. And that was a time when the economy was expanding in the United States. I did have arguments with him, and I remember one, I must have been about 11, and I said, but where's the end of this? Well, if we finish here, we'll go to Australia, expand there. I said, but what then? And we had a long argument about, this can't go on forever. And I was on the other side. So, I mean, it was interesting.
What was your earliest memory? I mean, concrete memory of an event or place or person? And how?
I think I was in, this is silly, I was in, what would you call it, a crib or something that size, on my back. I was, this is my memory, I'm not saying I didn't make it up. And somehow I had a shoelace that had, those little peeper things around it. And I couldn't have been that young, and I couldn't get it back in. And someone went and called my father, and he came and he did it. And it symbolized for me that he could do anything.
So you must have been wearing shoes, so you must have been
I may have just been playing with it. And I don't know what age that was, but I remember that, just so, and I just couldn't do it. And of course,
What was your first school?
My
first school? Did you go to a kindergarten kind of thing?
I went to a nursery school. I mentioned my grandmother was into the schooling, and she had been promoting nursery schools. There was kindergarten, I think at the age of 5, junior kindergarten at the age of 4, and then nursery school at the age of 3. And she had actually helped put an extension on one of the schools for the nursery school. And I guess I went there at a very young age of 3. It was just all part of whatever, she wrote some books on it, and I don't know what, I mean, people do now, but it was sort of new, I think, then, people doing that. And then I went through kindergartens, and these were what we call public schools, of course.
Yeah.
And that's when public schools were still very strong in the United States. Unfortunately, we were known for mass education along with Russia, and that was a great thing. And, it still is in some areas, but it's gotten very complicated, and taxes, and we don't need to talk about that, but that's really too bad.
And then you went on to high school. High school
It was a well-known high school.
And what age is that?
Let's see, that's age, it's what we would call the 9th grade. Are you about 13, 14, 15? No, graduate when you're 18. So take away 4, I guess.
So 14.
Yeah, I guess so.
But between 8 and 14, where are you?
There's what they call elementary school, and that was 1st through 6th grades. But if you were a little bit advanced, you go to the middle school at the 6th grade, so 6th, 7th, and 8th grades in the middle school. These are all relatively located in the area, and then you went to high school for the next four grades the way we do it. And then you would graduate there roughly at the age of 18 and go to college. And so I went through in this area. It was very, I was lucky.
They were all good schools.
They were very highly rated, and I'm very lucky to have been there. I can't say I necessarily deserved it more than anyone else. And I know that. But I was lucky. I had a very good cohort of friends. We had a jazz band, and that was very important.
This is in high school?
In high school.
Yeah.
And, a number of my friends also went to Harvard. I mean, it was a very elite.
But it wasn't fee-paying, it was
no.
public.
And you had to be able to, putting it bluntly, you had to be able to afford the residence in the house. I really don't know about how the tax system worked. I could go back and find out, but I didn't know at that point. But those schools would have been supported by local taxes, and so you get in the suburbs, you would get the better schools because they were local taxes.
And it wasn't boarding, it was...
No. There was actually what we would call a private school in that area. But most of us went to this other one, which was considered one of the best in the nation. Well, I don't know whether it was or not. I'm just saying that's the story that we got. And so most of us went to that.
What were you, apart from the academic side, you mentioned jazz, did you play an instrument?
Yes, early on started the clarinet, but then I switched to the saxophone and played that through high school, and we had, there were bands, and we organized, several of us, I guess there were 6 of us, a jazz band that we would actually play at dances and earn some money and, and all of that. There was a musical that I don't regard myself, I love music, but I don't regard myself as a very talented sort of player. By the time I was a junior, it was at 16 or 17 in high school, I had switched to basically to classical music. I had gotten an old LP that had Schubert's Unfinished, it must have been Day 5th. And then in those final years, my dad would bring me home, and he was not musical, LPs that I remember he brought home Beethoven's Ninth, and I would listen to it at night in bed, and I'd be awake for hours. And it went on from there. I mean, those are fairly simple, as well as straightforward ones, but I was entranced with all of that. To jump ahead, it was about 2 years ago. I mean, Mozart, then I got on to Haydn, and I decided to start listening to Haydn, and I listened first to the different orchestras and the conductors, and then I slowly acquired whatever it is, 3 or 4 symphonies. And then I sat down and I said, this is it, I'm going to listen to them all, which I did, and I still do, and I have them on my iTouch. It's very interesting that you could tell about, I can't remember now, about 40 or 41, you begin to see him really lengthening in depth. I have the same conductor all the way through, except for the London and the Paris symphonies. I also have Leonard Bernstein, and he's just, oh my goodness. But here in Halle, I'm deviating away from where you were at. Every time I can find an organ concert, and the organist here, and Bach and so forth, the churches here. Of course, that goes to King's too, but that's farther down.
I mean, I often ask people whether they feel that when they are fond of music or love music like you, whether they feel it has any relationship at all to their intellectual creativity and work.
In high school, not particularly, I was always interested in math. And, there was a 4-volume book, a set put out called The World of Mathematics, Essays on Mathematics. And I got that and read a lot of those. And I can't remember all of them, of course they'd be dated, but there was one by, was it Sir James Jeans, on music and math. And it began to talk about the relation between harmony and so forth in the mathematics of it. And I don't remember the details, and that was a very long time ago. But I've always thought that there has to be, I think, not just math, but there's something, and perhaps in the kind of music I enjoy, although Stravinsky and others too, that there's a sense often of symmetry, of pattern, of organization. I don't know that I've never really tried to express it that well, but there's something there.
Some people, as a result of that, actually deliberately use music. For example, sometimes when I'm going to write something which I think is important and difficult, I will listen to Handel. And it gets a sort of rhythm in my mind and an ambition. Do you ever...
I'm the reverse. I do not listen to music, certainly while I'm writing. And to relax, well, I used to find, unknown to me, if I'm driving somewhere and I don't pay attention when I'm driving, all of a sudden something happens here, I'll be out walking. And I don't want to be listening to anything. And you don't force it, and it just comes. Whatever problem you're working on, it'll, doesn't always solve, but it will come that way. So it's quiet versus some other input. It's precisely being relaxed and quiet that works for me.
Well, that's a theme I explore in all these interviews, so let's just pursue that a little further. I mean, there's a Latin tag, solvita ambulando. It is solved by walking. And most Dirac went for long walks, and most scientists have found. And Weber himself said, I never solved problems at my desk. It was when I left my desk and went for a walk. Is this what you find?
Oh, absolutely. I think the first time it really hit me was I had just returned to the United States, finished my dissertation, PhD, at Cambridge, and the PhD was partly about this ritual about parenthood, Kumbraska. I was working on that, and it was in my first year of teaching, and I was sitting at my office at the university and working on something, and there was something, another step, maybe the last step, was missing. And I remember getting up, and I just got up and I was going to drive home, and I'm driving, and boom. And I stopped, I think it was a convent, and I stopped in their parking lot, pulled a piece of paper out of what we call the glove compartment, and just, all I had to do was make a note or two, because I would never forget it. I thought, how appropriate, and that was it. I don't know how good or bad any one of these things happened here. I walk in from where we're at in the morning, and I'm not trying, and all of a sudden I know I'm going to write about this, and things just sort of, they're there, and then you sit down, and that's been the easiest of all. But it's absolutely just sort of walking. It doesn't always work, but you go out to walk to relax, or out to run to relax, which I used to do a lot, or just driving just to get somewhere. And it comes, which I think is very, it's obviously very interesting. I mean, it tells you about the mind and processing. And I often advise students now, just take your time, you'll get it. And it'll come. It's fascinating the way. Now, of course, one also wakes up in the middle of the night. And, I mean, sometimes you think it's great, and sometimes it's wrong, but it just won't even stop when you're sleeping, when you're intensely into something. But that's...
And when you wake in the morning, something has...
I know that, not right when I wake up. I mean, it'd be in the middle of the night and I go to sleep, but then I can't sleep as well because I don't want to forget it. But it, sometimes you write it right down. Sometimes it's just another step in the processing of it. You have to trust your mind and do it. It took me a long time to learn that. I wish I'd known that when I was really young. It would have been really good. Relax a bit more.
You mentioned earlier that your father felt he'd been passed over because of anti-Semitism.
There was no question about it.
And sort of 16, 17, 18 are often a time for assessing one's religion. Tell me, was it a religious household at all? Did you practice bar mitzvah or none of this?
None of that. And I think I recognize, I remained that way. I think I recognize much better now the timing of it. You're dealing with an earlier time of Jews still being very uncomfortable, and so trying to assimilate. And that's a long kind of story. It would have been Reform Judaism, in which it sort of was, moving toward sort of, we can call it Unitarian, or something like that. It was still close enough that people had that memory. As it turned out, my father's uncle, he would have been my great uncle, was also, he was the brother of my grandfather who was the chemist. He also was born in the United States, and he was, I guess, quite a good classicist. But he couldn't get a job in the United States. I think classics was also rather closed, and actually came back here to Germany, and couldn't get a job here. Was here during the First World War, and then couldn't get out in '32. Cordell Hull refused to let him back in the United States because he came to Germany. He died in Theresienstadt, and I found out about this. There was a long article about him. Those memories were all, I think, in the family. In the case of my father, it was the man who headed the company, the chairman of the board, said we can't have a chief head of the company because he won't be able to get into the social clubs. I think that's anti-Semitism. And it's changed quite a bit by now. And my father could have, would have, maybe should have seen that down the road better. I don't know. But he loved his work. So, I mean, in that sense, he had a great life.
And your own religious trajectory?
Every once in a while would go to a Sunday school, but that seemed to me to be a waste of time. I mean, I just don't, it's never been of great interest to me personally. I think I end up, ironically, to do the work, this was years ago on God Parenthood, I spent hours reading St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's enormous thought. I mean, just brilliant, obviously, thinking. And people don't read and talk about it now. But I learned much more about church theology than I ever expected, and was fascinated by it. And and admire the thought. It's not for me, but I could see. Oh my heavens! There's so much in Aquinas. Amateur. But I found a lot of the keys to understanding what was going on in what's called the Compadrosco in different parts of the world. He was deeply influenced by his philosophy, and I had a lot of fun reading it. And then, of course, labor and so forth. And in my field work, the people, it's ironic again. I won't go into the whole thing, but this was in my first field work in Panama. I was connected up to the bishop, who's the archbishop, and he was a very liberal. This was right after Vatican II, very liberal, and I did quite a bit on the people's ideology or theology and so forth. I wrote some of this up and gave it out to his parish priests so they would know, what am I doing? This is sort of, I always was amused by that. And we were quite good friends. He knew what I was, and he was really trying to help do something for the people. And explained as, well, they need to support, maybe this was his rationalization, they need to be able to support the church, so they need to be able to earn some money. So he was trying to help them do it. But he was, I think, in advance of his time. But, so I enjoyed,
So you find it interesting looking in from the outside, but you're an agnostic, basically, or an atheist, or are these labels too crude? Or
well, I'd say that's about the only mild disagreement that my wife and I have. I say I'm an agnostic, and she says she's an atheist. And she says hers cuts deeper than mine, because an atheist says God, and I say I don't know, and she says I'm admitting that there could be a God, and I'm saying no, I don't know how the universe started. Period. So I don't know with the label. I don't care about the label. I don't. But
you don't believe in a personal deity or a life after death, or
no, I do not. I think, that's it. So you better, do it now. Now then, I'm not, probably the best person to interview in all of this. Of course, then that leads you into, well, then what do you believe in? How do you ground your morals and so forth? And, an anthropologist.
You believe in the morals of anthropology.
Yeah.
What about the anti-religious? I mean, in Cambridge, certainly, and with scientists, I often ask them about Richard Dawkins and the sort of attack on, or the argument that religion is actually dangerous and evil and so on.
I haven't followed that. And who's that republished the book just 3 or 4 years ago? Attack as well. Well, I think those are good questions. The problem is there are all kinds of ways in which we move into, obviously, aggression, totalitarianism, and so forth. And it's a very complicated balance. In the broadest sense, religion, if you want, is a kind of, for me, it's a commitment to some kind of community, and humans do that. And then at the negative side, as Sir Isaiah Berlin pointed out years ago, brilliantly, I still love that, his essays on liberty. The negative side is, of course, that it can become exclusive, it can become totalitarian, it can become, this is the right way, obviously. And how you seek the balance between the two is, obviously, there is no, that's why it's always got to be a politically open discussion, I think. And it's fine if people have their beliefs, so long as they're liberal enough to let me have mine and let everyone else. I don't think you want to spend all this time talking about that. It's a very current issue. It has to do, obviously, with Islam and so forth.
Well, maybe we'll come back to it. One thing that often happens at high school or maybe middle school is that 1 or 2 individual teachers have a big influence. Did that happen at all in your case? Was there anyone you remember as being important?
There were some that were, for me, better than others. And I would say that, by and large, that didn't really happen until I got to Cambridge, when the world exploded intellectually. And, there were some that were good, and I was a reasonably dutiful student and kept working hard. I'd say the same in college. I had some who were very nice to me, but, I was a bit entranced in college with Parsonian sociology. And I got rid of that fairly, one goes through different kind of bumps. But I didn't directly work with him, with one of his, people who was one of his teaching assistants. But and there were others who were very nice to me. But intellectually, in terms of coming out of the shell and just being entranced with the world, it didn't really happen.
What were your subjects that you specialised in at school?
When are you talking about in college?
High school.
High school, you took a regular thing. You would take language. I did certainly. You have to do all these years of math, and I did. And I did that. I always enjoyed math. I'm not, a great mathematician, but even in college, I did several years of math. It was always fun. And you do chemistry and some biology, and arrange not too many options, history and so forth.
You like them all? You're interested in them?
I would say so. Something like math was always, I'd save it for last, sort of for relaxation. There's nothing, not some higher order thing. Most of them, I enjoyed them. I don't feel that one subject stood out over the others. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I left high school. Went to college. Maybe I'd become a doctor, I don't know.
College is university?
Harvard. I went to Harvard.
Yeah, I see, yeah.
And
so you must have been pretty good. When you
Well,
got,
I worked hard. I always thought there were all these other bright people around. I was never, never the best by any means. And I don't. So I always thought I had to work pretty hard. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. I remember at the end of my first year there, they had an evening where people from different subjects.
This is at Harvard.
At Harvard. I did. Yeah. I thought, well, maybe I'll do what they would call pre-med, which would involve chemistry, and I took several years of chemistry there and so forth. At the end of the first year, they had people from different subjects talk, different disciplines, and I listened to them all. And there was this one man who looked like a dried fish to me, and he talked about anthropology, and I mean not archaeology, but our kind of anthropology. And I walked out of there and I said to myself, I don't know what I want to be, but I know one thing. I'll never be an anthropologist. It's so boring. And I thought of that because, was I right? Had I misread him? What was the chemistry that we had? I was certainly wrong about my own prediction. Those things are good to happen. I did more sociology at Harvard.
You did what they call social relations.
I was exactly, and I did actually quite a bit of psychology. I don't think I officially had an anthropology course. I did do some. Evan Vogt had this big project in Chiapas, Mexico, and I was there for 6 weeks or something one summer, but nothing. I wouldn't grade myself very well on that. I didn't know what I wanted to do still by the time I finished college. And in retrospect, at the time I thought I should know, but I don't know. I just sort of looked around in retrospect, and probably held me back from getting into my career. But so I applied for a fellowship given by HM government, Marshall Scholarship. The British, and it's still ongoing, very much so, in thanks for the Marshall Plan and after the war. And this is a very competitive fellowship. I think there were 24 in the country. It's supposed to be given to smarts. I was lucky and got one. I don't know quite how. I didn't know what I was going to do. So there was not even sociology. So I said, well, I'll have to be social anthropology. And the only one that had, I was not really into a PhD, the only one that had an undergraduate program was Cambridge, which was the Tripos Part 2. And I wasn't ready, I didn't even know who Evans Pritchard was or anything else. And then I knew that there was this beautiful chapel in one of the colleges, and it looked like there was some anthropologists there. So I said, I want to go there. So they put me there at King's, it was just serendipity, and maybe not entirely. I did do some research, but little did I know what would happen. So I showed up there.
This is in 1960?
1961.
Yeah.
A long time ago. And it was a slightly different world. I remember walking into King's and I looked, this beautiful chapel. It was just sort of, oh my God, I think I'm in the right place, I don't know. And then I was put in, it's called the Garden Hostel, around the back. It was fine. And then I was supposed to show up to meet this advisor, now a supervisor.
Yeah.
I was a little bit disappointed because I thought, well, maybe I could have this man for this. I didn't know who he was, but I was assigned to this man named Leach. So I show up, and along comes this big, shambling guy. And
was this in Gibbs building?
This was at the Porter's Lodge. He said, well, what am I going to do with you? So we start kind of walking around. He didn't take me to the Gibbs building. We walk around and he shows me, he's giggling and laughing. One of the things that Edmund would do was kind of when he was nervous, he would giggle. And I've seen him do this in lectures. When he isn't quite sure what he's up to, giggling and laughing. And sort of, and he said, I don't know how to teach you or anything. He showed me up to the library And I thought, good God, what have I gotten into now? So I showed up maybe a day or so later to his office, which was in the Downing Street side. That's where the old Haddon Library used to be. And I think he had just come back from California, and it was he was there. And of course I had to show up with this gown on, which to me was bizarre. And I show up, and he's wearing a suit, and he's got a gown on. And I sit down in this wooden chair, and in comes this other man. And he's also dressed in a suit, and he says, I want to borrow that book. And Edmund says, no, you can't. You haven't returned the other one. So this guy who comes in grabs the book, and the two of them start wrestling. And then they said, oh my God, what am I doing? You know, well, that was Rail Fortune. And so, whom I also got to know and absolutely, really appreciate and his work. So Edmund throughout was always kind of saying, well, why don't you read what you want to read? And so I did some of that. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, and I think he probably put me on, after political systems and kinship and marriage and stuff, and it certainly looked weird. I remember reading Radcliffe Brown, and I said to him, this is like Parsons. And he looked at me and said, no, it's not. That was the most wonderful year. I remember it, I thought.
This is a prelim year, isn't it?
Yeah. And I did not work very hard at all. Then I'd read a little bit this, and a little bit of that. But Edmund, I'd come in, and he knew how to handle me, or maybe that's the way he was. I'd come in and make some outrageous comments about a book, and he just loved that. So, which was, I mean, that's just the way I did it. And then I'd say, well, what do you think? He would never answer. He would, he wasn't interested. But then after about 30 minutes, he would often start talking about something. And I'd go, oh my God. I mean, it was just brilliant response, it seemed to me at the time, to whatever the broader issue was. It wasn't just, the narrow thing. And he'd walk out of there just really excited. Years later, I read, I think it was Keane said, Essays in Biography. And
or Persuasion, Essays in Persuasion, perhaps. Yeah, and anyway,
I think there is that, but I think there's a biography.
Yeah.
And it's got these different people, and he tells about his teacher, Marshall, and back at the turn of that century, and going and coming out of a supervision with Marshall into the wet, dark night of Cambridge and carrying books and thinking that he was looking at and studying the most important thing in the world. And that's, I think, the way I ended up getting that first year with Edmund, even though I didn't do much work. But there was that tremendous charisma of his. And he, more than any other teacher, would encourage me, and it was more than just Edmund. I mean, it was Cambridge, to think independently and to look critically. Obviously, Edmund, but it was more than just that. I loved being in the college and spent hours talking to people and just sort of politics and everything just opened up, novels. So I didn't really focus. I still didn't know much anthropology. I didn't really focus on it.
Well, how is it different from Harvard? I imagine Harvard was like this.
Well, Harvard, you'd have courses, and the courses would be in blocks of semesters, fall and spring, and then you'd have exams as you go through it. And then that course would end and you'd start another. And it would be very much more based on lectures. Whereas at that time, Cambridge, there were lectures, but it might be once a week on ritual or once a week on kinship or something. And I certainly went to Meyer's lectures, but it was not the same kind of intensive lecture. I mean, it was 6 or 7 lectures. And you were supposed to learn a lot of it, obviously on your own and with your supervisor in that sort of way. And you didn't have exams. I mean, I was not used to this. I loved it. So I took advantage of it. And, you know, I've always looked back and said, should I have worked harder? And, well, I don't know, I didn't. And it was, it just, what I began to feel, and I give the credit to Edmund, but it would certainly be others, this sense of discovery that, certainly with Edmund, I still feel this about anthropology. There's something to discover in there behind all of what's here. And you're always after that kind of, there's something there that I'm going to uncover, that I'm going to understand, that I'm going to, you know, it's a great big puzzle in some ways. And that's just kept me going year after year. I mean, originally, of course, with Edmund, there was, you know, structuralism. Or
This was just the time when he was into structuralism.
As were some of us. It was Edmund's high time. And of course, Levi-Strauss was, you know, was coming in. And that, so there was this, you know, he had done, you know, Macro Cross Cousin, that was earlier, but now with coming out the, you know, Garden of Eden story and Solomon and all these others, and he was very much into it, and of course Levi-Strauss, and so this was just, oh my goodness, you know, we're going on about the universe with this. At least I thought so for a while.
And this is when he published Rethinking Anthropology. And
I got there right after he had published it, and we all read that, and just thought this was the key. I think with Edmund, it was always it's been very difficult for me to figure this out. You know, he would publish these things which would be enormously popular. I mean, he really was a wonderful writer. But they haven't, obviously, well, I shouldn't say this, not everyone would agree with me, I don't think they've lasted that well. And why is that? And how do you understand it? He was certainly an entrancing writer, obviously, in the Reef lectures and so forth. And trying to figure that out, I've talked to some people, Johnny Perry and so forth, about this, but I'm still not convinced, just as a piece of intellectual history, why, I mean, I've had students read some of it, and it just sort of flat for them. I don't think I would assign, I could, Rethinking Anthropology, but at the time, it just seemed to be a new world. And I think part of it, I don't know that this is at all correct, but Edmund, I always had the feeling that whatever he said, there was something more to discover behind it. And that he had some more kind of secret knowledge behind it, you know. And of course, that could have been my age, that could have been me, but I think if, you know, there'd be a little reference to Hegel or something. I said, oh my goodness, he knows. He didn't. But, and well, he knew something, but, or, you know, Marx. And, you know, at that time, these were names that just were not common, so he knew how to pick that stuff up, and always looked as if there was something deeper behind it. And maybe that's part of the issue. When you look at a lot of Edmund's work, and I haven't looked in years, obviously someone extraordinarily clever, but any kind of deeper something behind it, whatever that is, wasn't quite there, I think. I'm not sure this is right, but that was part of the excitement, because there was something more there for you to really understand. I'm not sure.
Do you think any of his, as you mentioned, the history of ideas, do you think any one or more of his books or articles are eternal?
Yeah. I think Political Systems of Highland Burma is beautiful. And it, you know, I mean, it just, you know, you can go in this direction and that direction. I guess it must have been my first year. I couldn't find a copy. He pulled off a copy, and it was an old hardback, and he inscribed it to me. He said, for Steve, the last copy of the first edition, with affection, Edmund. Well, of course, I got that up on the library shelf. And that book is still, I think that's, you know, I mean, a lot of people critiqued it and all of that, but the ideas he was, you know, playing around, fumbling with some ideas. I still think that the Natural Cross Cousin Marriage essay is, whew,
Mm.
you know, I mean, these are wonderful. Yeah, you know, I put those above all animal categories and verbal abuse. And come on, that's good. And I don't necessarily assign them to students now. And what you know, I just don't know. Some of that kind of ways of going at it has been out of favor, obviously, in the United States. Maybe it'll come back in. Those are really very, and there are others too. And you know, you could make a list, but those really stand out to me. Yeah.
Who were the other? You mentioned you went to other lectures and your other teachers, and perhaps more in your third year.
I was just there 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean.
I would, of course, being a student of Edmund, you know, there was Fortis, and of course everything he did was wrong, and then there was Jack Goody, and everything he did was wrong. So I would never say that now at all. I admire both of them very much. I went to lectures by Fortis, and I learned. Where I really learned was Meyer was very nice to me and allowed me to attend sort of the seminar for postgraduate students and members of the staff, where people would be talking about their fieldwork, and he let me into that. And that was held, the original one, in the Gibbs building.
In his room, yes.
And I think I learned a lot of anthropology by listening to the questions that people asked. I began to learn, particularly Meyer. You know, he was always in a certain kind of vein, but very good. I remember at one point him talking about a shanty and how a baby, if it died before 8 days, wouldn't be buried, and then he got off into citizenship. And I mean, it was a really, I learned, I didn't have to, yeah, well, of course you have to read, but I learned a lot from the kind of questions, and you see the angles that they had. And of course, Jack, he was writing Death, Property, and the Ancestors then, and I went to his lectures, and we had, inheritance, and Louis, Lodiga, and I would learn a lot from the kind of questions that they ask, and you see where their minds are at. And that, I think, really sticks with me. Rayo, whenever a visitor would come, a number of us had learned, some lecture, we'd sit near Rayo in the back, because he would mutter something. And he'd mutter just a word or two, and then we'd spend the rest of the lecture figuring out what was the connection between Rayo's word in the lecture. There was one time I heard him say, Rousseau. That one took us a while. But you always learn from this. And that's a more extreme kind of case.
Was he a lecturer then, or?
I think so, yes. But he was also going off to, little did I know at the point, going off to lectures in physics. I didn't know that there's a whole mathematical deduction named after him.
Yes. The fortune theorem.
Fortunato or fortunate, I think, numbers or something. And he would accost me and say, "You should go into physics." He was very nice.
But did you go to lectures by him or not?
No. I'm not sure he was lecturing. I think it was, if I can say so, an embarrassment for them. And I'm not sure he did any supervisions, but he was around, and he would come. One time I was talking, trying to work through my fieldwork, and he was talking about the Compadrosco, and from the back comes this voice, "Who do you think you are, God?" It was Rayo. But he was always very nice to me, actually. But, I'm sorry.
Was Gwilym Jones there then? G.I. Jones?
I met him, yes, and he had taught some called
Development. Yes, that's right.
And I went to that. It's only years later that I actually met him and kind of really talked to him. So I really didn't know him. You're right. But I didn't see much of him. Ray Abrams was just coming in. I think Martin Southwold was off final kind of years. Audrey Richards. I never really knew her very well. I've come to very much admire her work. I remember going to a series of lectures on methodology by her, and was very wise, really wise. I really admire Landleber and Diane, or whatever, Bemba, and it's a really fine work, and I wish people appreciated some of those things a bit more. I didn't really know her. I went to some seminars and lectures, but didn't really know her.
And who were your contemporaries as undergraduates? Was Johnny Parrier?
He was, when I came back, I had, in the Tripos year, there was Andrew and Marilyn Strathern, Nick Peterson, who was in King's with me, Jeffrey Benjamin, I'm missing something.
Carrie wasn't there.
No. Then, you see, then still didn't know what I was going to do, so I went back to the Harvard Business School and did 2 years there. And knew then, but what I was going to do and not do. When I came back, people like Johnny Perry were there, and Carrie, I can't remember whether they were, I think they were coming back. And then I went out right away and did field work. And I think by the time I came back, I mean, I was sort of delayed adolescence, whatever you want to call it, and sort of slow in getting into things compared to all the others who just seemed to be able to do it. Carrie, Johnny Perry, Keith Hart, with whom I've had long-term conversations and relationship. What I left out was in my second year of the Tripos, Adam Cooper arrived, and we became and have remained great friends ever since. That was wonderful.
To your second year, and Edmund.
Well, I'll finish out the first year because I just remember.
When I mean second year, I mean second year of the Tripos. In other words,
I took part 2.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
I never had any archaeology or anything. Unknowing about that, I became quite close with them. I mean, they were wonderful. Edmund, I would go out to dinner, stories away, every 2 to 3 weeks. Edmund would invite me out, and I got to know Celia quite well. And she's a marvelous cook. And I don't know, Edmund kind of took me, kind of almost pseudo-parents. I mean, I was quite independent. In that spring, he said he was going skiing in Italy. Did I want to come along? So I went. I went skiing with them. Edmund and Celia to Cervinia, and we traveled on the train. We eat every meal together and so forth. I did something that wasn't so good. I mean, I was in pretty good physical shape. I was playing rugby all the time, and I went up to the top of the mountain. It was nuts. I mean, I'm not a skier, really. And so I said, it's really beautiful up there. Come up with me. So he did. And he fell and broke his shoulder. And so, I mean, I was just horrified. So we get back, and he's got this big brace cast on or whatever. And I thought, oh God, what have I done now? I should never have said, come up there and do that. He was in his 50s or something. I don't know. I just always felt very, very guilty about that. But he was very nice. He never, never blamed me or anything. And so I had a wonderful year. I didn't do much work. After that first year, I went back, came back to the United States. By that time, John Kennedy, of course, was president. His Senate seat was empty, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought maybe politics would be interesting. So I wangled, actually through my father, connections to work for Teddy Kennedy. was running for a seat. And I spent the summer, I started at the bottom and worked, hid some obviously very bright people around, and I had a wonderful summer. Learning about politics. He asked me to stay on if he would win the election, but I decided that politics didn't have the foundation, didn't have the intellectual interest that I wanted, but it was a wonderful experience. Came back to Cambridge, second year, and then I began to get serious. That's actually when Adam Cooper arrived. We became great friends. We would talk all the time, and still do, about anthropology. He was coming in already with a training in anthropology and was going then out to the field often in South Africa. And but we kept up. That was very exciting. He was in King's too, and we would meet after dinner and talk. And of course, he knew a lot more than I did. And so I remember one time he was telling me, "Oh, you've got to read this book." It was Shapira, Swan of Law and Custom. So
yes.
I went to Heffer's and I get the book, and because you could buy books like that, and so I showed it to Edmund, and of course, that's not worth anything. So I didn't mind. I never minded anything. Edmund never once was, it was never hard on me. Never did. We got along. I think he knew that if he tried one of his things on me, I would. come back at him. But I would say it was only even halfway in that second year. I don't think I've even read the newer, and was reasonably lost. I'm overemphasizing it, but I did not absorb anthropology, and I could see all these people around me because I don't know, I had other interests and other kinds of things.
What other kinds of things were you doing? Were you doing drama or sport?
No, I talked to people. I did a lot of rugby and tennis, and I found it. I do a lot of other kind of reading, and I can't even remember. I mean, novels or anything. Would read. Oh, I think that's when I got entranced with people like George Kennan and his writings. And I mean, I would, all over the place I would read. And it was the first time in my life I just sort of, I don't know, I read a lot. I don't know what it added up to, but maybe it helped me a better anthropologist. So I finished out. When I finished, Meyer was always very nice. And he said that he had some, or could get some money if I wanted to go and do some field work in Thailand. And so I asked Edmund, and he said, "Oh no, that's CIA money." I wasn't ready to do field. I mean, I just psychologically wasn't positioned. I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went back. Of course, the Vietnam War was going on. If you're not, by that time, if you're not in school or college in the United States, you get drafted. And that I didn't want to do. And I thought, well, maybe I will become a businessman. So I went to Harvard Business School. And I did not like it. I didn't like the people. And I did, fellow students and their attitudes and what they wanted to achieve. I think I didn't learn economics there. They actually, the largest department or whatever was something on human relations. So it was sort of sociology, but it was out of the 1930s and 40s and the equilibrium theories and some more statistics there, and I enjoyed it. I was ready to quit, but I saw it through. And in the second year there, I met a man named George Cabot Lodge. That's elite Boston family. Ironically, he had run against Teddy Kennedy in the first election. So he was a liberal Republican. And somehow we became friends. I mean, he was a professor. And he had a connection, he had political connections. His father had been vice president of the country under Nixon. Under Nixon. No, he had been, it'll come back. His father had brought Dwight, his father had been senator, had brought Dwight Eisenhower back from Europe, President, blah. Anyway, George was a liberal Republican. They don't exist in that way, but kind of internationalist. And so he was interested in development, and that did appeal to me. And there was this thing going in Panama with, I've mentioned this, with this archbishop who was starting up cooperatives. And the business school was going to start up a new business school in Guatemala, and they taught by business cases. So we worked out a deal that was paid for by USAID, Agency for International Development, that I would write business cases for their business school. I would work with this cooperative movement and do my field work. So I went back to Cambridge just for a few months in the fall. My wife and I were married then, or that summer, and went back to Cambridge just to sort of get going. And I set out, of course I had to set out kind of a project I was going to do, of all things, because I had learned it. I set out decision theory. This is formal rationality. And I mean, I knew how to do it. You had the trees and branches at the time, and probabilities at the end, the subjective probabilities, Bayesian probabilities, what's the risk, and so forth. And I was going to analyze the agricultural choices of these, we call them campesinos or peasants. And everybody thought this was just terrific. And so I went to Panama, and
who was going to be your supervisor?
Edmund was all the way through. He knew nothing about it. I would say, I mean, no one knew Latin America, and it has taken me. I'm very glad of that because, well, that's a different story. I mean, there was nothing to hinder me from doing what the hell I wanted to do. But the decision tree stuff, I tried it for a day, and it made no sense. These are slash and burn Sweden farmers, you know, very poor, out in the countryside. So, I mean, they're not making decisions like that. So I said, oh, what the hell am I going to do now? And what I did was several different things. I did do, call it material economy, not just in the technological. I mean, I did extensive household, I did a survey, statistical survey of just kind of the household flows and inputs. I didn't know what I was going to do. I had no theory for it. That was the nice part. And of course, being Cambridge, well, I better look at kinship in the family. The problem was no lineages, no nothing. There was nothing that I knew from my background that was going to help me with these messy households with people coming and going. The only thing at the time was some stuff out of the Caribbean. But that was very different. I did there all of a sudden discover this crazy thing called godparenthood. And I got interested in it. And, and theirs were one. I remember one day, I said, oh my God. And I began to see it. And
explain for our general audience, compadre and compadrazgo.
What it is, and this is the Roman Catholic Church, and there are other variations, but classically there's baptism, as people would know, and I won't get into all the details, but you would have, in the simplest form, you might have a godfather and a godmother who serve as like parents in the church. I mean, it turns out it's a whole rebirth. Then, what compadrazgo is, and it used to be true, but after 1918, I think, it wasn't. They would form spiritual relationships with the baptized child and with the parents of the child. So you get this elaborate kind of network. It can get very elaborate. You can have it over confirmation. You can have it over haircutting. You can have it over marriage, none of which is officially recognized in the church anymore. And then you can have multiple ones, and there are all kinds of variations. What I saw was, and now it sounds very simple, was that it was kind of a reverse mirror of the nuclear family. And that's, you go back and I had a lot of trouble. It took me a long time to understand. They would call it, you have to keep respect for them. But what they really meant was we have a spiritual relationship. But if you are, and people were at that time, kinship is, a biogenetic thing, and not cultural whatever, it was very hard for me to get, what can a spiritual relationship be? How do I think about this? And, so that took me actually into a different way of thinking about kinship, which Schneider was coming along. And so you get much more into the symbolic dimension. But I had this, I didn't have anything worked out, but I had that insight, oh my God, it's connected like this, it's not just that. And that was something that I worked out and appeared in my dissertation, and the first thing I ever wrote after that. I won't go into the details of it. And it was between households, the nuclear family is here, that one was between. In the case that I did, and no one believes me, but they absolutely would not use it for lending and borrowing money, because they said compadres should never argue. They got to keep respect. So it was a very spiritual form of it. And of course, mints and others have always said, you're not practical enough, they're using it. Well, they didn't. I had a whole survey of them. They didn't use people in the villages, or shopkeepers, the way everyone else thinks should. This is the way they did it. And they would never choose inside the house. It had to be outside the house. So it was got to be a very interesting thing to work out. And I did much of that in the dissertation, although I worked on the family and the household family and so forth in the dissertation. And then published an essay, a very long essay. It won the Crow Essay. It was my first publication. And that was fun. Then I put it down, basically. Haven't done it since. And so that was, so I did, so then I got into sort of religious symbolism as well in the field, and not as much as many, but into, the saints and so forth. That was a lot of fun. And the whole liturgical calendar and the different kind of feasts. And the bishop gave me 4 volumes of leather, Butler, The Lives of the Saints, and I still have that. And these are all kind of wonderful kind of things. I don't know what to do with those books either. But I'll throw them away. So that's I then came back, and
it sounds as if you enjoyed your fieldwork.
it was very hard. I think it's lowland Panama. Of course, the Panama Canal, it's really, whatever you want to call it, jungly area, not right there, but very hot, very wet. And it sort of was interesting. It was hard physically, very tough.
And were you lonely and
well, my wife
bored?
was there, and that was
this is Roxanne?
Roxanne. We had gotten married, and she was a PhD student and just started at Harvard in a special program on developmental psychology. So she came and she was there, and what she knew enough to do, basically her PhD research on children's language acquisition. This was partly the time when Chomsky was hot and so forth. So she hadn't done a whole course, but did the research. So this became a complication later to work all of this kind of thing out, as we progress forward. But she was there the whole time, and she would find out things from the women. There was again a time when you mostly talked to men and so forth, and these women would come in, among other things, and tell her basically how they had been abused or hit by their spouses. So there were a lot of things that she had access to that I didn't and didn't think about. So that worked out. She was there the whole time. A wonderful sport about it. And goodness, we were just married, but it worked out fine. And she takes a lot of photographs, and still has some. Well, she's wonderful photographs. They're mostly black and white from those era, and had always getting different cameras into that kind of thing. So that worked. Came back to Cambridge with me, she was working on that, but then fairly soon we had a first daughter. I was, trying to write a PhD, which is always heavy, and that part is less memorable only in the sense that you're trying to write a PhD, and we all know what that's like.
Was Edmund helpful with the PhD?
I'd have to say no, not really. I didn't. There were very few models for me. The stuff from Mexico And, you know, in a sense I found, but most of the people were American writers, and I've always had this problem of moving, you know, from one continent to the other, because my heart and my mind is more on the European side, obviously. So you had people like George Foster, and he'd been in, it was different, but it was a village in Mexico, Tzintzuntzin, but it was, you know, kind of, well, peasant potters. But the kind of language and so forth, it didn't have the same discipline that, you know, that some of us were used to, and it was a different language. So I would read this stuff, Eric Wolf, Sid Mintz, but it was, they're tending to different tunes in a way, and I must have looked, insofar as they even looked at it, I must have looked very strange to them. And that's persisted always, and, you know, what is that divide? And, but, you know, it was good to come back to the United States. The first book was a rewritten dissertation, and then...
You came back as what, to the United States?
I came back, finished the PhD.
Who were your examiners?
Tandy was there by then, and Pitt Rivers started. He was replaced by John Barnes. And finished, and I didn't have any connections in the United States. So one of my old mentors, very nice man, Evan Vogt, said, well, there are jobs in Indiana and Minnesota. I went through both. They both offered me a job. It turned out that Minnesota had and has the outstanding whole separate program or department separately funded of child development, and that was perfect for Roxanne. And politics were more evil, very liberal state then at least. So I went there, and so then she had to shift her whole degree work there and start over. And I mean, it was not funny, but it was, you know, very, very, very good education for precisely her interests. And then we had a second child, and so I mean, life gets more complicated for everybody. It certainly slowed down her progress. But no regrets about it. I then, when I finished that book, I don't know what happened. I got interested really in economics. And I don't know who I first read, but it was a whole combination of things. Joan Robinson, Piero Sraffa was coming favorite. And I got very interested in Marx and the transformation problem, and had Sraffa solved it or not. And then dependency theory, which originates in Latin America, was coming out. And I don't know, within a year or two, all of a sudden, my economics material made sense, and I simply sat down and wrote a book and tried to use Sraffa and so forth. But it came out pretty well. It's still in print, and it gets used. And I would call it influenced by political economy in the classic sense of from, well, Adam Smith through Ricardo, who I just loved, up through Marx, and that's the classical political economy. But I liked it because it started with the class structure, who owns what, and that was much more anthropological than the neoclassical one, which is simply cut that off and this is the market's abstracted. Don't need to talk, but there was something really appealing to me, and I thought this was going to solve everything. And then it didn't. One of the things I think that from early on, I've always attended to, in anthropology, what people say in meetings. I don't know why. I think because I don't understand what they're doing or saying, and I have to really try to work to get it. And so I began to get much more in the meetings of it. And I knew this from Panama, where I would listen to this and I just didn't understand what they were saying. It was just a matter of another language. It was, what is it? And so this, I think, also helped bring me into a more cultural kind of analysis. And somehow, I don't know, I met Cliff Geertz, and then he invited me, this was in the 70s, he invited me to the Institute for Advanced Study, where he was, in reigning power. I was, again, lucky. Albert Hirschman was handling it, and they were really focused more on economics, but people doing wilder stuff. And the economists were very nice and let me attend all of their stuff. So, there were, Nobel Prize winners. Joe Stiglitz was working on information theory. Ollie Williamson was there sometimes talking. I didn't really like his stuff. He just recently got the Nobel Prize. And there were others of, really high rank. I would sit like I did at Cambridge and just listen, and you listen to their questions, you listen to their angle. I got into some fierce fights, but it on the one hand, it helped me get a much better grasp of economics, no formal training, but a better grasp, and I was reading a lot. And on the other, I got into culture, and so from Marx I got into these people called the physiocrats, and just was entranced and wrote about them. And then I began to try to, with, I won't say 100% success, try to think about economics as culture. And I was into metaphors, but not just the verbal metaphors a la Deirdre Donald McCloskey, but thinking about metaphors as models, and they were having their models of it, and we got our models of it, and then it gets you to horrible problems of epistemology, as I'm sure you know, and it took me a long time to work my way around some of that, but it does lead to a more relativist kind of position, I suppose, about economics, for better.
Did that not disturb the economists you were with, your relativism?
One time, and this was at the Institute, and I was talking to one of them, and I said, I can't figure out what they're doing here in the water, they're distributing it. And he said, well, it's all simple. I said, no, they're not. And he got so angry at me, he threw chalk at the board. I think the worst time I ever had, it must have been sometime after that, was I belonged to the Society for Economic Anthropology. And, I got into fights. And I didn't want all of these fights, but people really got angry at me. And one time, Society for Economic Anthropology, I don't remember, maybe in, St. Louis or somewhere, and they had invited in some of these big-time economists to talk to us. Maybe it was combined with someone else. Anyway, auditorium, lecture hall, Larry Summers, one of the bright young coming ones. This was before all of the rest of the story. Secretary of the Treasury, President of Harvard, and he gave this talk. I don't remember what it was, and I raised my hand and I said something, and I was critical, I'm sure, and I really don't remember what. And he was a little bit nonplussed, and up stood this anthropologist who's never liked my work, an economic anthropologist. He stood up and he said, don't listen to Steve, he's a nihilist. And I didn't, nothing more. It ends, and I walk out, and I just about took that guy who's attacked me in print before and since by the neck. But up came I've never seen them since, two French anthropologists. And they said, you're right. So then I thought, maybe I'm not. But that epitomized some of the time problems I've had over the years. I'm just trying to follow through, and think about things. And, but that I've had, the economists that I've gotten to know a lot, and there's some very, very, very bright people. On the one hand, I've become and am a member of the Association for Feminist Economics, and they're struggling with some of economics. And then there are all these other post-Marxist types, but they're not, I wouldn't even, who are interested in broader questions about economy. And I've been actually over the last, well now not so much, but I was attending more conferences and stuff with some of these people, as much as with anthropology. A very, very, very bright economist at Harvard. At the time, early on, I guess he was one of the youngest ever to grant tenure. But he's, not mainline, and he had picked up. He said, I saw a book review of one of your books in the economics literature, and the person attacked it, so I knew it had to be good. And he would have conferences, and just going and listening to him with clarity of his thought, I just pick up on it that way. And I mean, I read, but it's just interesting. And so I've been able, through that, to keep a foot over there, at least to know what's going on, and knowing down the line, who some of these great ones are going to be.
Can you, in the Wikipedia article on economic anthropology, the very simple picture it paints, and you could expand on this and make it, is that there is this economic theory which is formalism, which is applying Western models to all, Smithian models to all societies. This was then attacked by substantivism, which tries to take the internal models of the people and is very...
Not that directly, no. That is what I do. I would not call that substantivism.
Yeah.
The formalism is really neoclassical theory, and it's certainly not Marxist. It's neoclassical theory. The key there is two or three things. The rational actor who is optimizing, and that's still the absolute dominant paradigm. Market efficiency, which comes, the theory of it, won't go into it that much, comes from the Alfredo Pareto. And of all things, it's interesting. It's really a polymath. And that's it, the market is efficient. I won't go into those kind of terms.
And they're maximizing economic goals.
Oh yeah, homo economicus. It gets worked out. You have an internal preference schedule. You order it. You then maximize in terms of your choices of getting it. I think probably one of the key people, and it's always bothered me, I now have tried to, that anthropologists have not picked up on, Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker. And he really, Becker does away, I think, with everything we stand for, or do, or are interested in. He can explain reciprocity and altruism. I don't know if I can, and I don't know if Moses is right, but for Becker, it all comes down to, I have a preference scale. And it could be that I want ice cream. It could be that I just want money. It could be that my preference scale is altruism. Or it could be my preference scale, it all depends. And the preference scale is inside of me as a self-interested. He plays the game. I maximize my preferences. My preferences could be love, they could be hate. So he's having his cake and eating it too. It's still the maximizing shell around it, but then I could put in self-interest on the inside. I think that's sleight of hand, worthy. No, I won't say worthy of Edmund, but that's sleight of hand. And it's bothered, and then he applies this. He's applied it to theory of marriage, family, and so forth. Not many anthropologists have picked up on it. Some historians have. And that troubles me, that they don't recognize, maybe it's right, but they don't recognize the theory that lies behind it. That's formalism. That's been the easiest one for anthropologists to apply. It's obviously what I started with and dropped, and it's been applied. You can, look at not just family, you look at potters, you look at this and that.
So would you characterize, for example, Raymond Firth's work in this way?
Yes, I would. He, has an MA or had an MA in economics. I must say, though, some, primitive economics is a New Zealand Maori and TKP, a primitive Polynesian economy. A lot of good ethnography in there. He didn't. I don't think Firth and I don't think Edmund ever quite confronted this or solved it. And I don't think they saw it as clearly as they might have. They certainly were not in the camp of Polanyi. Then it is very true, I discovered Polanyi in this kind of period. Substantivism, as it's called. And, obviously a big fight about all of that. But I think
can you characterize substantivism?
Yeah. One simple way is form, substance. Formalism, substance. Classic division in going back, I suppose, Greek thought. And he was talking about, at one level, I'll characterize it my way in just a minute. He was talking about at one level the very substances by which we live, and that there's a material in exchange between human and the environment. Some people claim he's Marxist. I don't think so. He claimed that the two things that make society are land and labor, and so when you put these, I'm simplifying, when you put these on the market and you sell them, they are what he called fictitious commodities, but the more you do that, the more you destroy society itself. So you're turning society inside out and putting it becomes, as he would say, disembedded. Now, way I would characterize it, and I'm not sure this is people necessarily, but formalism, yeah, its form, it is very rationalistic. Going back to Descartes, it's very deductive. And, I mean, I was entranced by Ricardo. And he was the first one, really, to have a deductive model in economics. And that's very characteristic of, becomes of neoclassical economics. Your assumption is maximization, we're doing that, and then you have theorems. And, the more it can include, the stronger it's, more acceptable. And there's Pareto 1 and Pareto 2. Those are the first and second fundamental theorem of economics. We've been very proud of that, and it is beautiful thought. But I would say that's very rationalistic. I've always felt that Karl Polanyi, in substantivism, that, a big part of my heart is there, was empiricism. Because what Polanyi did was build typologies. And he tried to build a typology with what he called reciprocity, redistribution in the market. You could classify all societies, and then there's a little addendum that I'll come to. And so the idea was you keep developing a typology. It's what Edmund would have called butterfly collecting. And that's empiricism. That's classical empiricism, in which the more I develop it, I'll come to the roots and the fundaments there. They are both, and I'm going ahead quickly, in my view, they're both a kind of essentialist. One way I'll get to it from here, and the other way I'll get to it there. And I'd have to, but I find those are ways that really help me understand these different mindset approaches to them. The thing that I'm laughing about Polanyi is he had trouble with another form, which is called the house economy. And I'm laughing about it because he had to have seen this all over the place in Hungary where he grew up. And of course I've had to look at those. They don't really fit very well into his nice kind of typology, and it never sort of been worked out. So there's those two. Then of course there's been a Marxist kind of approaches, which, it gained great favor into the 60s and 70s, a lot of it out of France. And using Marx, that's been good, but I think that's not as practiced as much. And I worked more in the domain of what I call local models. That's where I was saying I don't think Polanyi was there in local models. What are the people's models of it? How are they modeling economy? And once, it doesn't mean that they're going to have everything all worked out, but you start to listen to their kind of theories of it and their kind of values. And I would say that it gets more Weberian in a sense.
Verstehen. Verstehen. And
absolutely. Yeah. And understanding.
Intuitive understanding.
Yeah. Well, I hope it's more than intuitive. You listen to the language, you watch what they're doing. And I then went back to Colombia. I went to Colombia with a former student of mine. And I thought, well, I better find out, where Panama had come from. And I think that is what we did. We got their model of the house economy, conversations in Colombia. And it was certainly Verstehen all the way through, but it was conversations, but related to their practices. And that was the really fun part of that. And loved that field work. We did it together because we were going to do separate and comparison and all of that kind of stuff, but we just talked our way through it all the time. Back, he knew where I was at, back and forth, and he was Colombian, and he could remember things from his childhood, this kind of phrase and that, and just deepened it historically for us. And It was a lot of fun. So that was a kind of response to kind of deepen cultural economics in a way. I don't use that phrase that much. So I did that, and then I said, I want something more. There was still something missing, so a long odyssey of trying to develop a more cross-cultural comparative economics. And if you're not a formalist, not a substantivist, how are you going to begin to do this? And I had another year or two off. Let's see, that is California. And then I finally wrote a book that was published in about 2001, Anthropology of Economy, and finished that, and that wasn't satisfactory. And,
in what way?
I don't know. I sat down and wrote another book, Economy's Tension. It was still, I didn't have, the framework was implicit. And I really, all I did in Economy's Tension was just take it and make it, get to the nub of it, which I think is, I mean, you could phrase it in a lot of ways. The Economy's Tension, at the level, it's the tension between formalism and substantivism, not quite directly. My point is, we all live with it, and it's all part of economies. And then once you do that, then you get into power and get into things like mystification, where one side, the market, is often mystifying itself as if it's a set of friendly social relationships. But that's a way of selling. So that is mystification. I'm jumping ahead. I think we're all torn between these two sides. I mean, not all of us. And the recent blowout shows how some people don't give a damn about anybody else. But, you know, I mean, I collected, what did I find? I found an old phrasing, your friendly bank, Chase Manhattan, I have it, I just wrote it down, chasing your friendly banker at Chase Manhattan. How many of us are friendly bankers? So I love some of these. That's what I call mystification, where they're using community to sell markets. And that's economy's tension. A lot of us live it every day and don't bother about it, but I think we see it in theory and we see it in everyday practices, and then that leads you to think about economy as a series of different spheres. I think Paul Bohannon was onto something years ago, and in which we get more and more abstract spheres up there. Now, what I call finance of finance, derivatives and so forth, which are, well, it gets even more. Economy's tension, you go back to Aristotle, and you have things that are instrumental, means to ends activities, economy, and then you have things that are done for their own sake. And you find this in parts of Aristotle. I'm no Aristotelian scholar at all, but you see it over and over again, and that's really the difference between sort of economy, if you want, and social relationships, which are kept for their own sake. And Veblen was onto this, and in some of his writings, he calls it a derangement. I love that word of Veblen, in which all of a sudden this one, the instrumental activity, it's done for its own sake, its own pleasure. So I make up these derivative instruments, and I have fun just making them up. It becomes an autonomous, reified activity, and it's done for its own sake rather than in instrumentality. So I mean, life gets very, that for Veblen would be a derangement. And so a lot of people have been onto this kind of thing, and I had to pull it together better, and I still am.
Well, one hint I got from reading that Wikipedia article was that in a way you felt that there was no such thing as the economy. Now this is a truism for most of us who work in the third world, that the economy is embedded and you do things for multiple reasons. But I wondered how far you felt this was also true, say, of America or advanced economies. In other words, people are not doing things, they're not rational actors, they're doing things for a multiple reasons, and most of them are not economic in the narrow sense.
Well, on the one hand, there has been, and people are getting Nobel Prizes for this, a whole kind of critique of the rational actor, imperfect information. We don't process it correctly. And they get all kinds, sometimes called experimental economics, that we're not rational actors. I think that's a different kind of argument from more closely to what you're talking about and what interests me. I mean, I accept that none of us are perfectly rational actors. There's what they call imperfect information for it. But it's this other side. Now, I think I was just indicating that when you get to, say, just to Wall Street or the city, and people are simply working with money, and then they get working with, sometimes they call it algorithms, where they're just doing it, not even with the money, or with people. There's been a division even in banking at the highest sphere, in which there used to be something called relational banking, in which the big firms were friends with the people and all of this kind of stuff. But now, with the computer and so forth, we're going to the stage where it's really an abstraction. So the effect that my stuff in Wall Street is going to have on Greece and so forth, I don't care. Now that is it seems to me there's an increasing abstraction in that. It used to be just commerce and buyer beware, and then we get into interest rates and so forth, but now we're at another level where it's these tools or instruments of mass accumulation that you're just doing it for its own sake and you don't care about others. Then these people make money and then they set up a charitable foundation to help people. Now that intrigues me. What's in their minds? And then, the extreme case was, because I think it's part of the same thing going on, this Bernie Madoff, who had, $50 or $60 billion pyramid scam, in which he's just taking money from some people, giving it to others, and keeping a lot for himself and not investing it. Everybody thought he was a kindly man, and ruthless, mean. That's the economy's tension. How do we talk about those things? And of course he destroyed some people. And then at the end, of course, he feels badly about it. What's going on in these people's minds? And then, you see then these narratives or justifications by people on Wall Street. They'll say, well, we're providing liquidity for the economy. That's my function. And now I think that Weber, I turn Weber around, I love his work, but I begin to think the Protestant ethic wasn't quite the arrow, so to speak, crudely put, coming down, affecting behavior. It was a story about the behavior to justify it. And so then Weber's got a story about the Protestant ethic. And you begin to see these things as stories that people tell themselves. And we all do it, and I do it, I'm sure, and everyone does. And those are part of the economy, and the stories we use to justify it, but we're getting more and more reified in it, and we don't see these ways in which we treat the other. Somewhere I cite him, Collingwood. What is it? The wonderful 1 or 2 sentences about, I treat you as an other on condition that I let you treat me as an other, It's sort of characterizing market behavior. I don't quite remember. But I think that's can very much go on in economy. And that's really the extreme market side. And then people will say, but Steve, you make friends with the shopkeeper here and there. And I'm a little more cautious about assuming that they're my friend.
One characteristic way in which you paint yourself is quite pugnacious. You're prepared to attack people high up in economics, and you stand up to Edmund. And some of your friends are similarly quite pugnacious like Edmund, and also Keith Hart. I wondered whether you'd like to say anything about Keith.
Well, Keith and I have a long relationship too, and he's on the one hand been a really nice supporter of me, and I really appreciate it. And you know, he's called my some of my work the best done and all of this kind of stuff. And Keith is very, very bright and very capable. But we do sometimes disagree a bit, and you know, well, I mean, we do. I do my stuff, and I'm happy with it. I wouldn't want to characterize. I mean, we agree in some ways so much that, you know, but I think Keith doesn't always, I think, appreciate or like, I'm not sure the word to use, and it wouldn't be fair of me to put words on, forays more into economics. He's more into a humanistic side. That's fine. He certainly, I think he's more pugnacious than I am. I may be wrong. I think he feels that early on I may have attacked him once, you know, 40 years ago.
But you like his famous work on the informal economy and
yeah,
black economy.
What I like best is it clearly fits the lecture he gave early on about, you know, the Malinowski lecture on
the two sides of the coins,
because that obviously fits what I'm talking about, and I like that one. And actually, there's a nice one on trust and building up trust.
There was a whole book of which
yes,
yeah.
That's correct. And I like that one.
And his work on money.
Well, I've done on money too. I mean, the two sides of the coin. I think that's, you know, that's basically the, you know, the kind of fun. I've done on money, and I do it somewhat differently, and that's all I can say. I do it. So I haven't written as much as he has, but I won't go into it. But I do in both my more recent books, particularly the last one, and I'm writing more now, which would be different from what he's doing. And what can I say?
A question I often ask is, if you were, as you will perhaps do, advising a young anthropologist who's starting out on their PhD and their career, apart from saying don't do it,
Right.
in terms of sort of styles of academic work and so on, is there any advice you'd give them about what to do or what not to do?
I think that's a really, really difficult question. The field has changed so much. And you have what would they focus on and where? And my first advice would be somehow it has to come from you. You have to, what are the things that would interest you to look into? You know, if you don't have that, you can't sustain yourself at all. And that, I don't know if that really answers your question.
So it's a passionate curiosity about the world.
You have a curiosity and a feel for it. I do think there are some real skills to being an anthropologist, and not just, you know, but what I might locate as skills, other people might locate differently. I think that ability or desire to want to listen, to hear, it is frustrating, to understand what others are doing and have a sense of, call it the sociology of it. It's not just psychology or psychoanalysis. I'm not decrying them at all. My brother's an analyst, but it's more of the pattern of the social relationships. And what's, you know, what are the meanings of it? What are people doing? And seeing the patterns of it. And I think, at least, I mean, that's crucial for me. And I don't see how you could be an anthropologist without having some kind of feel for that. How you investigate that and how you find it. And I've certainly used statistics and questionnaires and that you just use anything and everything you can. And don't rule that out. I don't think it's just a matter. Certainly, you have to have a desire to talk with people. You have to have a desire to live their lives. Obviously, I'm not saying anything new since Malinowski, but look, there's a lot of anthropology when that doesn't occur, and it doesn't take for me. And I won't go into the different kind of examples. I think that's partly why I'm less comfortable in the American context, obviously. I still haven't fully answered advice to someone coming into it. I think people don't even know. You have to discover those things as you do it. How are you going to know in advance what you're doing? I mean, that's part of the wonderful history of anthropology. I don't know what I'm going to discover. That's great.
One person you mentioned in passing who I've interviewed was Clifford Geertz.
Yes.
And what would you say about his influence on your work, or him as an anthropologist?
It must have been, in the early 70s at his book, the wonderful book.
Interpretation and Cultures.
And I just, thought that was just terrific. And it is. And I think that's part of what took me, to the Institute and maybe in that, among other things. I have not followed all of the books since then, and all of the essays. It is unrelated really to practices. And that, for me, and obviously a lot of people into that, but it comes back to basic kind of British anthropology of what are people doing at Malinowski. And I think that the Geertzian influence goes off, a little bit too far. I think Solom's trying to get at some of this in Culture and Practical Reason, but I don't think he got it quite right either. I don't have a perfect answer but I mean, I try to stay away from just looking up. The trick is to relate to people's practices and what they're doing, and you're trying to make sense of it. And that's where certainly the symbolic dimension of the Geertz, Schneider would enter in, but that's not the whole story. If it were the whole story, the bulking would be over. I don't know if that answers you well enough. And that's fallen out of favor too. I get into these things and then I get on to something else.
You mentioned Marshall Sahlins then. I mean, again, how do you...
I had read Culture, I had other things too, Culture and Practical Reason, and I wrote a long review of it for one of the journals. And I remember inviting him to give a lecture, and he said he's going to talk, I thought he said he was going to talk about cooking. And so we were talking when he arrived, before he gave the lecture, and I actually asked him, because he was in Culture Practical Reason, goes up to France, comes back speaking French, Lévi-Strauss, and I actually asked him about history. I said, where does history enter in? Well, then, the lecture he gave was, I think, one of the first things he did with Captain Cook. But it's still, and I'm no expert, he still has not given up that whole structuralist kind of angle. I had not read his latest stuff. And so, it just isn't where I'm at. Stone Age economics raises the eyebrows of everybody. I mean, that was an extraordinarily interesting thing.
Wonderful book.
Wonderful book. I co-hosted or whatever a session at the AAA some years ago at, it was 35th or 25th or whatever year. It was published in 1965. And invited different people to give commentaries on it. But Marshall, being Marshall, stood up and said, well, he was never an economic anthropologist and seemed to be angry at all of us. And I mean, the book has been critiqued for this and that and the other thing, but I think if you're coming in and when you first read some of those essays,
It really makes you think, yes. There's just 5 minutes left, so we can stop there, but is there anything that you think I should have asked you to talk about, or it's always unsatisfactory with life because afterwards you remember all the things?
Oh yeah, I'm sure I'll think in 3 minutes.
Is there any part of your life, or Roxanne, or anything, or your children, or anything you want to?
Well, that's been a very central part of our lives, and our daughters, and we're all staying in very close contact. They're all grown now. Eldest is a lawyer in California, and she works for basically a pro bono kind of. She writes opinions on cases into things like Planned Parenthood in the United States and illegal immigrants, and is into that sort of thing, and very good at it, and appeared on TV. The second daughter is a lawyer for a hedge fund, and that's interesting. And the third daughter I'll say it on here, she graduated, wonderful athlete, graduated with called America Reads for a year, and went to the University of Chicago to take a master's degree in social science. Didn't like the anthropologists. Rick Schrader she liked, and he's a wonderful guy. And she is now at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. That's where Valen is at. They're a fine college. She is a soccer coach, and she's a supreme. She sort of practices psychology and takes these intellectual girls, and they do very well. She played soccer and lacrosse in college, and just is a natural talent, and very smart. The three girls all went to Harvard, and that's where, through Harvard, I met Roxanne as well. She's a developmental psychologist with lots of interests, and is always feeding me something else to read on anthropology.
Lovely. Well, it's probably a very nice note to end on your family, so thank you very much indeed. That was lovely.
My pleasure.